can see a life together, standing by you, and I think I want to forever. And after all has come and gone through all the years, I can't believe the moment's finally here. And you never looked so beautiful. You're everything I've waited for, and so much more, standing right in front of me. And we could weather every high and low. If love is going where we go to have it hope forever, let's start our life together. Let's start our life together. Let's start our life together.
Welcome, everybody, to our second webinar of our webinar series that we are hosting as part of a new centre that has been set up in Singapore, based at the National University of Singapore, the Centre for Holistic Initiatives. I have to look this up, for learning and development. I have to get that right. CHILD for short. So CHILD is a new, as I said, Singapore-based centre with the National University of Singapore and our partners, including the Lean Foundation, the Singapore Institute for Clinical Sciences, and the Centre for Evidence and Implementation, which I am the executive director of. In this capacity here, I am lucky enough to be the acting at this stage co-director of CHILD. I have another director working with me based at NUS and form part of the steering committee. However, today I'm facilitating this fabulous webinar with these fabulous guests, all focusing on or thinking about some of the challenges that we have to meet that relate to the mission of CHILD, and that is accelerating the use of good evidence and good data and policy and practice in Singapore to improve outcomes for kids in the early years of their life. And helping them, enable them to have the best start to life. And also informing research and the development of research projects by partnering with people in the field around what priorities people have, what programs and services we need to design, and how can we better integrate services across the island. So I'm going to introduce this fabulous panel who have agreed to do this, and as per usual, with very little prep from me, because I think it keeps it edgier. So firstly, we have Professor Richie Poulton joining us. He's the director of the Dunedin Multidisciplinary Health and Development Research Unit, which is one of the longest longitudinal study based in New Zealand. He pointed out before that it's been going for 50 years, but he really wanted me to don't think that 50 years is implies anything around him. The second person I'd like to introduce is a special guest. That is Jimmy Lachlan. I hope I said that okay. I'm not great with names. Jimmy is the Chief Development Officer with a group called MMS over in New Zealand as well, a social service agency based in Dunedin in New Zealand. I met Jimmy for the first time last week. He's going to have some terrific on-the-ground experience to share, and will be a very welcome mystery guest. The third person I would like to introduce is Carrie Albright. She's the Chief Research Facilitation and Knowledge Management and Deputy Director at UNICEF's dedicated research centre based in Florence, Italy. Carrie is being very kind, but by not showing us any photos of Florence to distract us completely from our job here and the fact that I'm coming to you from Melbourne, the city that's been in the longest lockdown of any city in the world with COVID. So thank you for being kind to us, Carrie. And finally, but definitely not the least, is Professor Yap Sing Chong, So most of you would be very familiar with Yap Singh. I'm lucky enough to work with him on setting up Child Within Singapore. He's the Dean of Medicine at the National University of Singapore, a clinical investigator, and one of the leaders of the Gusto study, which is a really important body of work in Singapore that's helping us accelerate our work in child. So thank you to the four of you for agreeing to join. Could you please, audience, as you think of questions, please post them in the Q&A down the bottom. And you can start posting questions at any time. I will be watching that. We do like to make this interactive, so I will be looking for questions to kind of post to the panelists. In the first instance, I'm going to invite each of them to speak for about 5-6 or so minutes about their work. I'm going to start with you, Richie. I'm interested in hearing what is your experience that has been the most striking example of good data and good evidence in early childhood being translated and used effectively in a policy-making context or a practice or community service context, and what do you think enabled that to happen, and what was the result? And if you could also say a little bit more about yourself at the beginning, because I was quite brief on your bio, just for context. So please, Richie, you go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Robin. And greetings, everyone out there listening. So it's a pleasure to be here and talk about my experiences. And this is very much a New Zealand perspective. I will provide, and I'll be doing it with my mate, Jimmy. We will hand back and forth between us because we've been working as a team for a while now. So my day job is to direct the Dunedin Multidisciplinary Health and Development Study, which has been going for almost 50 years. As Robin was pointing out, I clearly didn't start it because I still look relatively young, at least to me, looking at myself on the screen. I was only about 9 years old when the study started. It's arguably the most detailed study of human development ever undertaken, and I am quoting others when I say that because I don't want to appear immodest. But it's well regarded in the world of life course research, and I might add that the Gusto study for its generation, I think, is now being viewed as the preeminent study of its generation. So Singapore and ourselves have a proud legacy, I believe, in this particular space. We've published a lot of work, 1,300 or more journal articles and books and chapters and other things over the years, but I'm going to single out one particular seminal paper that came out a decade ago because it's really the entry point for tonight's discussion. It was a paper that looked at what is known as self-control in childhood, or self-regulation, if that's your preferred terminology, and showed that where you were placed on a distribution ranging from having low levels of self-regulation or control right to having the highest levels and everything in between, predicted quite strongly how well you did later in life as a grown-up across multiple life domains, be it in the educational or work sphere, be it interpersonally in relationships, be it in terms of managing to avoid having difficulties emotionally and physical ailments, be it in terms of your ability to parent in a nice, kind, caring, sensitive, stimulating way that is ideal, be it an ability to stay out of jail and off benefits, social benefits. In other words, you might boil it down to say, how do you pick on some aspect of childhood development that may confer resilience to the vicissitudes or the challenges that we all encounter in life so that we can actually overcome and then still be successful? So our work showed more clearly than any other work in the past, simply because we had so much information that we could bring to the task to test the idea, including control variables such as poverty, IQ, which up until the point we did this study was suggested to be the two fundamental causes or drivers of human outcomes. We adjusted for that and found that self-control was incredibly important in a pervasive way for human beings in their life chances and ultimately life success or otherwise. Now, with findings like that, it garnered a lot of attention amongst our colleagues and led to a lot of replication, and it's been cited 1,000 times and more than 1,000 times in just 10 years. And that's all very well and good. But actually, quite frankly, after 25 years, quarter of a century doing this stuff, that bores me. I don't do it for that reason. I do this research because I believe it can help people living real lives and to make their lives better. If for some reason, often not their doing, they end up behind the start line, behind the 8 ball at the beginning. We all know that intervening earlier is by far the preferable timing of intervention, because young people are far more open to environmental input. They're far more malleable or plastic, as the scientists might say. Don't take me literally there. They're just far more porous and absorb a lot more from the world around them. If it's good stuff around them, they'll pick it up and it will embed. If it's bad stuff, sadly, the opposite will occur and they'll become damaged, sometimes very badly. And that also will echo down through their life. So I got out around the traps. I spoke to politicians. I spoke to stakeholders in the service industry, any person interested in child development and child well-being was a potential stakeholder to me. And I did whatever I did every other time I thought there was a public health message worthy of promulgation. But luckily this time, 2 things happened. I took up a part-time role as a chief science advisor to several social sector ministries in New Zealand, and subsequently became a chief science advisor to the Prime Minister, who has a special interest in child well-being. And the second thing was, on par with the prime ministerial link, was Jimmy McLaughlin walks into my office about half a dozen years ago, and he says, "Hey, I hear you've done this work on self-control. It sounds pretty interesting to me. Can you tell me more about it?" So he and I had a conversation that just has not stopped, because he took the bit between his teeth and he brought a whole bunch of expertise that is absolutely critical to making things work, related to how do you make this scale up or work? How do you make it take hold first in the real world with all the messiness of the real world? How do you make it embed and get people excited about it, and then go to the government and say, this is a good business here. This is a really good idea. We can make it work out there in the real world. And we need to think about carefully scaling so this will actually stick and embed across the country. So all the children from this generation on reap the benefits of interventions. The question becomes, of course, is there some good stuff out there that can guide the interventions? Luckily, also a really good timing thing is that in my department that I recently moved to, because I took the study from the medical school where it started across to the psychology department, because I thought that was the future for the Dunedin study. And in that staff complement, there were 2 researchers. One was doing self-regulation interventions using games that kids like to play, and leveraging those games and strengthening the elements of those games that children before school starting age would play naturally and engage with and continue to practice well outside the school or early childhood education setting, addressing 2 of the main problems with interventions to improve self-regulation. One is generalization. It doesn't go beyond where they're taught. And 2, about maintenance. They don't keep doing it. So that's a person called Dione Healy, and she'd been working in that area for 10 years. And then there's another woman, Professor Elaine Rees, who'd been working on language acquisition for almost 25 years with very early age children. We're talking about 18 months, 2 years. And she's got her own reputation, international in that space. And so Jimmy, Elaine, Dione, and us, and me, the Dunedin study, we were all just sitting in the same town, same time. And at least we had the wit to think this could be something worth pursuing. And so we did what was required to get stuck in. And I'll hand over to Jimmy because he'll tell you about
I was going to say, I'm interested to hear what Jimmy's got to say, because you sound like you're getting at some magical ingredient on translating research into practice. So Jimmy, you have 4 minutes to tell us how to do this.
Thanks, Robin, and greetings, everybody. Just very briefly, as Robin mentioned, I'm based at a social service provider in the South Island of New Zealand, and we were interested when I started in my role about 8 years or 7 years ago now. I was interested in what could we do down here at the bottom of the country, at the bottom of the world, that would have a big life course impact for as many people as possible on a national and ideally global scale. And as Richie said, I pestered my way into his office, knocked on his door because I'd been inspired by a YouTube clip where I saw Richie speaking, and the rest has sort of followed from there. So my role is to sit across the research, policy, and practice sectors. I'm not a specialist in any one of the three, but I'm a sufficient generalist, and I'm able to, I think, understand and translate across the three. For the first couple of years of doing this work, I had no idea that's what I was doing. But it seemed to me there was a need to connect the really powerful knowledge, powerful evidence, the acquired wisdom around how can we support healthy childhood development. Also, in my orbit was a really big sector, really big, diverse early childhood education sector full of passionate people who are putting their bodies and minds on the line every day and absolutely want the best for our children, but don't always have the best access to the evidence in a usable way. And then the third element was our policy and funding people who, again, are well-intentioned, looking for good initiatives, looking for things to implement. And it seemed to me there was a missing ingredient. There was a missing kind of intermediary role in there, and which I subsequently know is performed by organisations, like Child, and work that Robin and others do. But when we started, we didn't know that was a thing. Well, I'd never heard of implementation science. We didn't. All I was interested in was scaling up good ideas. We didn't know what that would take. So, as Richie's already explained, we had a bit of a Goldilocks situation here. We had all of this powerful knowledge. We had these great practitioners on the intervention side. I was stumbling my way through trying to learn how to be a good, effective intermediary in terms of translational practice. And we had a small country with a prime minister who was, quite motivated to understand more. So we've taken Engage, which is the program Richie's talking about, which now is little games on cards. It's developing children's self-regulation skills through play. It's simple, it's robust, it's versatile, it can be modified to different cultures, languages, it's extremely effective, it's fun to do, and it's cheap. All of that was in place when we found it. That hasn't changed since the day I found it, when Dione generously gave me the manual and said, go and have a play with this. But what we've done since is take it from a small program that had a small evidence base delivered from parents to their children primarily. And we're now well on the way to scaling it up across New Zealand. We have 4,500 early childhood education providers in New Zealand, quite a diverse sector in terms of practice type, ethnicity, language. And we have a government-funded scaling pilot that's now delivering to 130, and we're going to step up into the thousands, hopefully, over the next couple of years. So that's an example of a piece of practice, and we can talk more about that and about the ingredients that have helped that to succeed. And just briefly, an example of one where perhaps these things haven't, quite aligned is, for us, is the work around language and communication in the early years. And we're now working on rectifying that with a big randomized controlled trial and a couple of other initiatives that are learning from what we've done with Engage. But just a few observations to kind of kick this rest of this conversation off. I think if you look at those disciplines around language, early literacy, communication skills, there's a lot of passion, a lot of partisanship in terms of our subject matter experts. There's, the reading wars. It's a very divisive kind of knowledge base. The delivery of those interventions tends to be a little more intensive or technical, and they're very much interrelated with culture and relationships. Yeah. When you compare that to, say, what we have with self-regulation, where culture absolutely is a big factor and there is some complexity, one is much more built for scale and has a much more sort of greenfields evidence base. One is very, it's a real minefield of passion and opinion and difference. And I also think that's really achievable. We can and will achieve good scaling outcomes in that part of development, but it's a great example of an area that needs really strong, skilled intermediaries to connect up the three legs of the stool. So I think we've got examples here in New Zealand of where it's working well and where there's perhaps still some work to do, and would be interested in everyone else's thoughts on how that compares in other countries.
I'm going to come back to you, Jimmy. I've got a couple of specific things on the ingredients to succeed question, and a few other that are some things for us to think about with our work with Child. Kerry, I want to go to you next, and just if you could just comment on, with your background around evidence synthesis, knowledge broking, some of the work around research, translation, implementation science that UNICEF is really taking a global lead on. How do you see, just thinking about what Richie and Jimmy said, or in your experience, especially in terms of child well-being, how do you think those areas can contribute?
Sure, thanks, Robin. And yeah, it's a real pleasure for me to be here today as well and to contribute to this very exciting child webinar series. So, I mean, as you know, Robin, I'm somebody who's really passionate about evidence for children. So it's really exciting to see the emergence of child and see these areas, you know, evidence synthesis, implementation, research, behavioral sciences, etc., all is a key part of it. So to really, I mean, maybe just to start on the evidence synthesis question, UNICEF has had for 3 or 4 years now a long-standing relationship with the Campbell collaboration. I think probably for this audience, I don't need to talk about the dangers of relying on single studies to make policies and the need to sort of set findings within the broader body of evidence. But
maybe just comment on that quickly. I don't think it's, just say a couple of words about that. I think this audience would be interested in what you just said there.
Sure. So, I mean, I think if, you know, obviously, if you're relying on just a single study, it may particularly, you know, the findings may work in your particular context, etc. But it's only when you see several studies, a package of evidence, if you like, that you can actually really start to understand, to see, you know, outliers, or conversely, to have confidence that the finding that you found are echoed and can be replicated elsewhere. So yeah, so we've worked with Campbell to develop a series of products called evidence gap maps, which are simply put a sort of matrix or a grid of interventions on the x-axis and of outcomes on the y-axis. And these kind of report studies, normally impact evaluations or systematic reviews on the effectiveness of interventions. But unlike systematic reviews, they don't say what works, they say more what exists. And we found them to be really sort of simple, intuitive, helpful, interactive visual tools to both map the state of the evidence and the gaps. So one particular example, we've produced this mega map of child well-being, called mega because it's one level higher. It maps existing syntheses. So it looks at 484 systematic reviews, 25 evidence and gap maps globally, looking at child well-being, including ECD. And the strategic way that we've used it is we've mapped the evidence against the 5 goals of UNICEF's current strategic plan, a 4-year strategic plan, around every child survives and thrives, learns, is protected from violence and exploitation, lives in a clean and safe environment, and has an equitable chance in life. And, we found this really useful, both in terms of research priority setting, but also for helping policymakers and practitioners to find evidence to inform decision-making and indeed for fundraising. But importantly, this mega map is a living map. It's updated annually as new evidence emerges. And equally importantly, it's not just left there. There are sort of very active knowledge brokering elements to it, such as, we've just heard. I think that's really important. So looking at, summarizing the findings against each goal area, podcasts, social media videos, news articles, etc. And I think that active knowledge brokering is really important, finding, potential end users, working with them throughout to identify both how to use the content, setting the policy questions. And I can talk a little bit later on if, a couple of key examples, but I also just wanted to touch quickly on implementation research. So of course, as important as it is to define the global and the global evidence base and the regional evidence base through synthesis, it's equally, if not more important, to look at local context and implementation factors. Thinking through whether an intervention that's been successful in one context is likely to work in another. So if you like, moving from what works to how it works and why. Mm-hmm. And I think, many researchers and indeed many funders, when you're requesting, evidence of the impact of research, tend to stop at policy formulation, job done. And I think far few people have actually looked at implementation factors. So in answer to your question about, how do you better bridge research and policy and practice in early childhood, this no-do gap, this lack of understanding of implementation factors, to my mind, has been a real impediment to success. So you see that, in recent years, more and more countries are adopting multi-sectoral policies on ECD. Yet still very few of them have institutionalized mechanisms to implement these policies. Services often remain quite fragmented or of variable quality. When you do see programs at scale, they're quite rare, but they're very poorly evaluated. And I think, we really need to help policymakers more to think about, more systematic implementation data that can help, guide both administrative and fiscal decisions. So the sorts of questions like, what are the most important contextual factors for success in my context? The different combinations of services and policies or interventions in different order, the sequencing, does that lead to different results? How do we actually take these pilots to scale and make them sustainable? How do we build the capacity? And of course, how much is it going to cost us? Really important questions. And then, it's the same with behavioral sciences. I think, many ECD programs are often seeking to sort of influence or enhance behaviors of young children's families, caregivers, service providers, through providing information and awareness raising. But of course, just providing that information alone isn't enough to sustain behavior change. And I think, behavioral sciences have really been undervalued in our sector. Generally, there's a scarcity of evidence-based behavioral interventions in the ECD space and a lack of empirical evidence, especially beyond public health, I'd say. And I think this is there's real potential here to strengthen the evidence base on both behavioral insights and behavioral sciences more broadly, looking at things like nudges on how to ensure young children get vaccinated, overcoming gender-related barriers, discrimination against disabled kids, et cetera, et cetera. So why hasn't this been done before? I mean, I think the whole academic incentive system is set against many of these things. Promotion, tenure, publishing system. It's all skewed towards generating new research, not towards synthesizing existing research. I think there's also been some quite frankly, quite snooty considerations that implementation research is not proper research. Concerns over rigor or bias, or certainly in terms of evaluation, and that it's more sort of operational, practical, rather than sort of pushing the boundaries of science, if you like. But I think it's really essential, this applied research, if we want to achieve the SDGs. So could it be done? Yes. Should it be done? Absolutely. And I think Child is a really exciting new centre and is really well placed to be able to help deliver on some of this.
Thank you, Kerry. There's so much in there that we could just grab, and if I get a chance, or one of the Child staff who I know are online get a chance, the mega map that UNICEF and the Campbell collaboration did is online and available free for anyone to use, and it's an example of how synthesizing good evidence and making it available is a public good. And once we're able to do that on a more global and a collaborative way, which is another piece of work that Child wants to contribute to, then we can get on with the sort of stuff Jimmy was talking about how to think about adapting that on the ground, how to get reactions from providers about what they think and what they think will be practical and useful, doing, small tests of rapid improvement. So I very much appreciate UNICEF and Campbell Collaboration's contribution to global science and making it accessible and speeding it up, so I don't need to continually interrogate the literature over and over again, and I can go to your work. So, Yap Singh, I'd appreciate to hear from you now in terms of some reactions to what you're hearing and the context in Singapore, and some examples of some nice translation work with policy and practice. So please go ahead.
Sorry, thanks, Robin. Well, first of all, just to give you context, besides being an obstetrician and dean of the medical school, the reason why I'm actually on this webinar is because of a study that my colleagues and I launched about 11 years ago, called the Growing Up in Singapore Towards Healthy Outcomes Study, or GUSTO. So this study has yielded a lot of interesting findings that have been accepted by the government as the basis for some new policies that they are introducing. So, and I guess the first thing I'd like to pick up on is what Richie said about knowledge brokering. you just have to talk to people, everybody who will listen to you about what you think is important, right? So just to give you an example, once I was at a meeting and I was sitting next to the permanent secretary for the Ministry for Health, and then when the break came, and then she sort of turned around to me and said, what's happening in your studies? And I, just told her about what I thought was really interesting. And she said, oh, that's important. Why don't you come and present it to the Ministry of Health? So just 1 month later, I received an email to present my findings to the Ministry of Health. And I did that. And so basically it was around gestational diabetes and how Singapore was actually underdiagnosing gestational diabetes. So we published this paper in 2014. I had a conversation with the permanent secretary in August 2015. September 2015, I presented the findings. And in March 2017, they had changed the policy to reflect this finding. So basically, in 2017 March, the government decided to implement universal testing for gestational diabetes for all pregnant women in Singapore, as opposed to the high-risk sort of screening that we were doing at that time. So this is an example of how just always talking about your findings, the findings that you think are important to whoever will listen to you, can actually make a lot of difference and give you opportunities to really influence thinking in the government. So that's just one example. And one important point about being passionate about the science that you do and presenting what you think is important to whoever will listen. The second point I'll pick up is what Carrie said about contextualizing evidence, right? So one of the strengths of the Gusto study is because it's done in Singapore, on people living in Singapore, we can be quite sure that the findings would apply to our local setting, right? So traditionally, a lot of the science that people work on usually comes from the West, but bearing in mind that Singapore is in the heart of Asia, with people from Chinese, Malay, Indian, and other ancestries. A lot of times the findings from the West don't actually apply here. So being able to have that Asian context, not only Asian context, but also an urban, a heavy populated urban context is very important. So I think that's another thing that is critical to have your evidence coming from a source that you can rely on that will actually apply in your local setting. So I know, Robin, you can probably give many examples of interventions that have been imported from overseas and put into a different context that don't actually work, although they cost a lot of money, right? So I think that's the second important thing. And the third point I'd pick up is also from Carrie, the importance of implementation science, behavioral science. So these are new areas to me personally, but it's something that I sort of picked up quite early on. And we launched a Center for Behavioral and Implementation Science Interventions about a year ago. In fact, Robin, you are one of the directors for that center. So we recognize the importance of understanding human behaviors and understanding that implementation is a science. And you can't just assume that if you have a good idea that people will follow your instructions or that the interventions will actually stick. So I think these are the main points that I brought up, which I think are very important in considering if you want to translate evidence into practice and policy.
And I'm relieved, Yapsing, to hear that we have you over the line, that just telling people to do it won't necessarily make it happen. That's excellent. Richie, and firstly to the audience, please start posting your questions. We've got a good one there from an Anouk, but I want to hold on that for a second and go up to Richie and just get some thoughts, Richie, on what you've heard there, the difficulties around single studies, and I want to get some secret sauce going in implementing the community and scaling. And if we can just keep it brief, because as soon as I said questions, they're going to start coming in. So Richie, if I can just get a couple of reactions from you, please.
Sure, and both relate to comments from Kerry. So I totally endorse this idea that single studies don't provide anything other than interesting suggestions, that you want to get a body of research that is consistently pointing towards a particular set of findings before you invest heavily in the public sphere, because you don't want to waste money, basically. And, a single study is, I'm very proud of the Dunedin study, but I would never suggest that until it's replicated in multiple different contexts that you can actually regard anything as a fact. The second thing I loved, which was Kerry's terminology around the hubris that comes with traditional science. She called it the snootiness around doing applied or implementation work or translational work. I think it's by far the most important form of science. I think it's the hardest to do. That's why people turn their noses up at it. They like to say it's B-grade science, but the truth is it's bloody hard. And only the very best can actually manage to take it on and maybe be successful. In my days in Wellington, our capital, doing my science advice, I often heard war stories from long-term bureaucrats who said the typical outcome is poor quality science implemented in a reasonable fashion is stuck around, and the best quality science and knowledge that was poorly implemented never saw the light of day. It never stuck. So if that's the common outcome, it's a tragedy. And that's why implementation science is a serious and critical new hope, really, for making sure that the knowledge development actually will matter, that the taxpayers from the public good funders who invest in it to matter actually get some return on that investment. So I applaud the fact that you're getting really professional around this area. If I may give you one tragic 30-second example of where stuff hasn't happened that was so obvious. I was part of a six-member group that it recommended that the Child and Family Service in New Zealand, the ministry, be completely dismantled and they start again because it had failed generations. So these are the most vulnerable children in the country, the ones that often end up in care. We set up a new ministry. The government, we gave them a plan, a really detailed plan. And to our surprise, the government of the day said, yes, we'll do that. They set up a new ministry. They didn't read the plan carefully, though, because we said, if it doesn't work for Māori, this service, because 2/3 of the clients are Māori, it won't work at all. What did they do? They set up a new service. They changed buildings. They changed the name of the service. They didn't change the personnel, nor did they change the culture. All right? So you had the same traditional approach that was not cognizant or sensitive to issues of being Māori in our country. And it has failed. It has been a public disgrace. The first chief executive had to ignominiously leave office, and now it's been subject to multiple commissions of inquiry. And they're basically going to have to start again. So they had a great plan, and they just, because of politics, and we can't neglect that incredibly important barrier, because of the politics, nothing really happened as it should have.
That is a terrific and yet oh so depressing story. And there's always a lot to learn from when something didn't work as much as when something did work. And unfortunately, to get the what didn't work story out of folks is very, very difficult, especially when people are the CEO of an attempt. You don't find many CEOs to go, well, I set this thing up and it didn't work and here's all the reasons why. So I appreciate, Richie, where you are putting your focus and reminding us all not to repeat mistakes of the past. In that, Jimmy, I'd like to ask you, because I was, and I want to acknowledge this may not be within the implementation science literature in a formal kind of trial way, but you talked about ingredients to succeed. And so I just would like to hear a couple of in the scale ups that you did or whatever successful trial in a really kind of practical sense, what are those ingredients to succeed, and what should we or could we be building in from what you've seen was worked with your scaling? Thanks.
Absolutely. So the initial point to make when we're talking about, again, if we just pick those three important parts of the pieces of the puzzle, which is research, policy, and practice, when we're thinking about how to fund and sustain and grow good science, we have to pass through that policy route often. There are obviously other funders that can help achieve scale, and there are other ways of resourcing the work. But if we're talking about making science compelling and useful to a policy audience, we basically have to get our head around the fact that we need the science to scale in some way, because very few policy contexts are interested in delivering good science to 6 people. We're talking about delivering good science to a population or a region or a continent, or if it's more intensive and more focused, you're still talking about thousands, tens of thousands of people. So some of the ingredients for success in actually bringing good evidence into the real world and into practice, some of this is in the literature, some of it is probably a little more kind of hard-earned insight from implementation. The first thing I would say, which is almost always overlooked, is demand. If we're going to implement good quality science, we have to understand the populations that we're trying to work with or support. What are they actually interested in here? What's the demand at their end? Either a demand for something new and positive, or a demand for resolving or improving a situation. Because without demand, without significant interest and significant demand from the people you're trying to ultimately serve, you really are working into a headwind in terms of implementing science. It's a really important kind of first principle around, does anybody want this yet? And if they don't, maybe our first job isn't implementing science, maybe it's education, communicating, understanding. Perhaps we're not ready for implementing yet. That's the first one. The second one, when we're getting towards actually doing the work, is that concept of ecological validity, the idea that our ideas have to be packaged up and delivered in a way that fits that environment. And if we're talking about the early childhood education sector or early childhood development, Richie mentioned it at the start, it's messy. It's chaos. Anybody who's raised or supported anybody under the age of 5 or 6 knows it's one of the great joys and challenges of early childhood development. It's unpredictable. Our sectors for educating and caring for little people are also fragmented, diverse. So our ideas have to sometimes be repackaged or slightly refitted in a way that makes them usable. And this is that concept of ecological validity. And so the third thing is, how do you do that? And it's through this idea of rapid cycles and finding a harmony or a balance between what might be the sort of scientifically pure version of the idea or the science, and what's the rough and ready, robust, resilient version that's going to work in the real world. There may be some trade-offs in that process. And so what you need is representatives who all have expertise, but also have the big picture in mind. They can do that trading off. There's a harmonizing you need to do between those things, because I think a lot of time we expect evidence to go from small scale to large scale with very little drop off. The reality is it probably is often going to dive a little. You don't want this. At the moment, we talk about the valley of death or the chasm of death in terms of taking from small scale to large. A lot of the reason for that is because we set these unrealistic expectations that effect sizes are going to carry over untouched from small scale to a massive population basis. So we have to make rapid, iterative changes, and we have to do it in teams where we're well represented across all the interest areas. And then the final point, I think, is very often when we're coming in with research expertise or policy expertise or passion in one form or another, we get very good at just telling people what to do. And that lends itself often to a very superficial, very top-down training focus in the way we deliver programs, or we just blast out a message and that's it. Where, again, the evidence and the examples in the field that have had more success, one of the common elements they often have is an approach that's more about coaching or getting alongside our populations rather than doing things to them. So there are some basic principles that are actually not hard to do on the ground. But when you're doing them in multiple disciplines where you've got competing interests or competing priorities, that's where you really need that intermediary to help you harmonise those approaches and strike that nice balance between those really pure scientific outcomes on a small clinical scale and a good outcome for a big, messy population. In New Zealand at the moment, what Richie and I and others are starting to think about is how do we just saturate our children with opportunities? How do we make sure that whatever culture you're from, whatever language you speak, whatever your experience is, there's something for you that comes from a place of good evidence that fits your lifestyle, that fits your reality? And how do we build on this over a period of years so you can't turn a corner in New Zealand without finding a good opportunity for child development? We're a long way from that. But if you imagine that as your future, you start to look at how diverse our approaches need to be around implementing.
Yeah, that's really, really good. And it's I'm watching the clock here because we've got questions now coming in thick and fast. It's actually given me a good idea for an event next year. But I'm going to go to Kerry, you first, with one of the questions, and then Yapsing, I have one for you that's specifically around Singapore. But Kerry, very early on, someone is complimenting the amazing panel. It's coming to us from the Abu Dhabi Early Childhood Authority, understanding that we shouldn't use these single studies for the foundations of government policies or interventions. However, if we're using cross-sectional government administrative data sets to drive insights, would you believe it would be useful to translate these insights to interventions and public policy? So I think the person is saying, again, I can't use single studies, but all I've got at hand is administrative data and other things. Is that kind of enough to translate and design intervention, or what else could we be doing in your experience working across the globe? And then I'm going to go to Yaps and something similar.
So yeah, thanks, Anouk, for the question. And yeah, of course, I mean, admin data where it exists, and I think that's an important consideration, that it doesn't always exist to the level that it perhaps should in many countries around the world. Issues like birth registration, for example, tend to be missing in many countries, maybe not so much in Abu Dhabi. So yes, of course, admin data is a really important insight, and looking cross-sectorally even more so. And similarly within UNICEF, I mean, we run two of the most well-known sort of large-scale household surveys, the DHS and mixed data sets globally, and also have, we're the custodian of developing a method to track SDG indicator 4.2.1 around ECD. So, we developed a large sort of measure or scale, the ECDI 2030. It's the recommended instrument to track ECD interventions, and it's now tracking 42 indicators, I think, around ECD in 197 countries around the world. So those large scale data sets, the national data sets, hugely important, but they of course will give you one particular sort of insight. They'll give you quantitative insights, and there are other sorts of questions where you would need more qualitative methods, including implementation research, to be able to answer sort of different sorts of contextual questions and to be able to drill down beyond the sort of the national level. So of course you start with what you have, but I would say, as any good science, triangulate where you can and look for other data sources too. Mm-hmm.
There's something that Child is going to be working on with some of the government groups in Singapore called the EASL trial. And there's another one called the Appetite Toolkit. And these are based on findings from Gusto and other high quality research to design universal approaches to improving social emotional outcomes, executive functioning of kids. And one of the things we're going to have to use some of that data to understand where the need is, but also, Jimmy, bring in your secret sauce in terms of, the training plus coaching model. So it's this nice ability to essentially do what Richie was saying before and unite all these different areas of kind of discovery science into figuring out how to implement it well and bringing those groups together, which is hard stakeholder work. And then context really matters. So Yapsing, there is a question here with a request to just discuss a little bit more about the context-specific differences in research to policy implementation in Singapore versus other countries in your experience. Like, what is it that we need to think about in particular in Singapore?
Thanks, Robert. That's an important question, and I think one thing we are very fortunate in in Singapore is that we have a government that is very willing to listen to science and evidence. And in determining policy, they don't really have to make so many concessions due to political considerations. So let me take you back to that incident where I spoke to the permanent secretary back in August 2015, right? So I told her about the gestational diabetes finding. That was a straightforward health problem. So the Ministry of Health implemented it, in less than 3 years. Then I also told her at the same chat that our findings in gastro showed that if mothers had high levels of depressive symptoms, that it would affect the baby's neurodevelopment, brain development. We had evidence from MRI studies at 1 week of life that there were differences in the brain of the babies of mothers with higher depressive symptoms. And then we had evidence from 4-year-old IQ tests that again, these children of depressed mothers had poorer performance in school readiness skills. So a body of evidence suggesting that the mood on mothers had a major effect on the child's brain development. So when I told this finding to the permanent secretary, she was very, very fast. She said, "Oh, for this finding, not much point. I mean, you can present to the Ministry of Health, but you need to present to a multi-ministry forum because you'll require many people to act together. If you want to relieve the stress of mothers, it's not just a matter of Ministry of Health. You need Ministry of Social Family Development to step in. You need Ministry of Manpower to change the work conditions of mothers." So she saw that straight away, so it requires multiple parties, agencies, and ministries to work together, which is not always an easy thing to make happen, right? So finally, last year, the year before, I had the opportunity to present these findings to a meeting of several ministries. And they were basically all in agreement. This is an important area that they had to work on. And then this year in March, there was the government convened a multi-ministry, multi-agency task force just look at child and maternal health and well-being. And some of the findings we surfaced are now being seriously considered to be turned into a strategy, which will be unveiled in January next year, a 5-year strategy to improve maternal and child health and well-being. So that's an example of how you need people to want to work together and who are able to work together. And it's not just the government, you need a whole of society approach. So Child, the Center for Holistic Initiatives for Learning and Development, this was possible because we had a philanthropic organization, the Lian Foundation, was willing to step up, identify that this is an important area they want to work in, and to actually give us the resources to, convene a center that could bring this work forward. So I think that's something that is unique in Singapore. We have people who are listen to science and willing to work together, and especially to invest in early childhood development.
And I would, working a little bit with you in Singapore, would agree with that. We're 7 minutes in. There's some terrific questions that all have a little bit of a theme of give me some really practical advice. So there's a few things like what would, if there were 2 or 3 things. So I'm going to go to each of you. And if there was some very, 1 or 2 things that you think as child, as we sort of start to do some of our evidence synthesis work, our designing interventions and partnering with community services to implement it in early childhood, our service integration work, particularly across disciplines that may not work together, health, early childhood, social work, psych, do the impossible, the holy grail, that is integrating services that have been shown to be effective. I mean, I would like to pull that off in one country before I decide to find another career. So if there was just 1 or 2 things that you would say, okay, you guys at Child, your collaboration, the 4 partners and other collaborators that we'll have in Singapore and the globe, what's your advice to us as we're starting out as an evidence intermediary in Singapore? And I'm going to go to Kerry first. I'm going to mix it up. And then Yap Singh, you'll still get the last word.
Thanks, Robin. So, I mean, I think my number one message would be to echo what Jimmy was saying about demand. I think, really looking at balancing that. So not only do you actually start with the demand and start with users and what people really want in a very practical way, so you're not risking producing evidence that sits on shelves, but also that you're actually not just acting from a supply side when you're brokering and condensing different evidence, but you're really building capacity at local level to be able to analyze and to undertake a process of thinking about evidence synthesis and evidence brokering yourselves, so that we're doing ourselves out of a job, I think. And there, in a context like Singapore, there's fantastic local capacity, but it doesn't always exist in contexts like that all around the world. The other thing, I looked at Harsh's question in the chat about, how can we get implementation science taken more seriously? And I think, there has been, in recent years, more and more journals that are coming there. And I think we do need to actually publish seriously about our experiences, rather than, people who are kind of action orientated don't often necessarily always want to take the time to sit down rigorously and document. But I think that really helps. But journals is just obviously one source. I think, the speaking to the public and engaging and using social media and all sorts of different channels and tools is really important, to look at different audiences. And then I think in terms of, the added value of child, I think already the areas that you're thinking about looking at are added value to me. But I think looking at the intersectionality, the cross-sectorality is really important. Thinking about, if ECD is already cross-cutting as an area, but if you have an intervention in say the health sector, is that at the expense of something in the education sector? And looking at the sort of the trade-off analysis and helping to think through really practical decision support tools, it would be something that'd be a massive contribution.
Terrific. Jimmy, you're next.
I've just got a very specific example that perhaps contains some of those elements. When we're working with that kind of multi-sector audience, which, as you say, Robin, is sort of the holy grail in terms of implementing good science in different settings. It's a really simple thing, but understanding the key people is critical. A few well-aligned and well-understood people from different sectors can help to build a really powerful consensus. We have an example at the moment where that's working really well, which is self-regulation and engage. We're doing some work in a health context, in a criminal justice, care and protection context. We're working with multiple age groups, multiple cultures and languages. It's taken 4 or 5 years, though, to bring that together, and a lot of time put into the relationships, a huge amount of time. We've also had an example where that worked really poorly, in a slightly different context where we worked, and we had subject matter expertise, we had great practitioners, we had a lot of the other elements, but we hadn't taken the time to understand how the people perhaps further apart from each other on the ring of collaborators were going to understand each other. And we just had a real breakdown between, in this case, some really skilled speech language therapists and some people who were responsible for operations in the criminal justice system. So I think there is a really strong human factors in here. So spending the time to understand who are those key people, and as Kerry talked about, doing a lot of good communicating, good science communication in different channels, different levels of expertise is really important. It's a real investment in people, I think.
One of the things I love about doing implementation work is it's about people. It's just the best and kind of the hardest. Richie, what advice have you got? And then Yapsing, you get the final word. And you're on mute, and I cannot believe I had to say that. My gosh, there we go.
So 3 points quickly. The first one is to truly appreciate and respect community wisdom. Don't pay lip service to it. Don't consult whether your parents are partnering and co-production. Genuinely go and sit at the feet of the community and say, teach us what we need to know. The second point is knock on a lot of doors without fear or favor. Most people think to go into a big building where there are very important people with lots of nameplates and degrees and everything else after the names, is too scary. Challenge. Put it to one side. Talk to everyone that has a stake, right to the top of the pile. and don't get told no. The third point is just get on with it. Don't wait for the government to give you a handout. Don't wait for permission from government. Don't wait for state sanction. Now, this may be harder in certain countries than others, but I'll tell you what I've learned in New Zealand is quietly go off with your mates like Jimmy, build it, give it to them on a plate with the proof they need, and they'll take it at the right time. If you wait around for them to get in behind it from the very get-go, you'll be waiting forever.
I am so enjoying this part of your career, Professor Polton. Just nailing. Very, very good. Yapsing, you get the final word and then I'll wrap up.
Okay, so as time is running out, I'll just make 2 points, right? So number one is that I think it's important to have a really interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary approach to what we are doing, right? So we have clinicians, biomedical scientists, implementation scientists, behavioral scientists, psychologists, educators, and the social services all working together, with the community. So I think that it's important to have that interdisciplinary approach. Number two is to not just do more of the same. So I think, whenever we start something new, it's always, okay, let's just reinforce whatever we're doing and things will get better. But I don't think that's going to work. So I think we really should be on the lookout for new approaches, new ideas, things that will move the needle, and then really go for it. So those are my 2 points.
All right. So call to action from all four of our panelists. Well, thank you very, very much for saying yes when I asked you to do this. And again, just for the audience, I did not prep them very much. So they're thinking on their feet in a very inspirational way. And I'm very grateful. And Child and the partners of Child, thank you. Please, audience, tune in on the 16th of November, 9 a.m. Singapore time will be our next webinar. We will hopefully announce some of the speakers very soon, and have a terrific Wednesday in no matter what time zone you're in. And thank you very much.
Look in your eyes, and I can see a life together. Standing by